Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Advances. We look ahead at what's happening in the legislature this week. I'm Brandon Waltons, here with Michael Quinn Sullivan. And it's hard to believe, we're still in the early days of the legislative session, but we're now about a month into this thing. It's hard to believe we're already that far along. And we've seen a lot of action sort of picking up from what we talked about last week. We've seen a lot of action happening in the Senate. The House has been, let's say, a bit slower than their colleagues across the hall. But that doesn't mean that there's not some things to look forward to this week. Most of it in the Senate, but also some in the House. And so we're going to be talking about some of this. But first, I want to talk about something real quick that happened over the weekend. Folks may have saw this story up at TexasScorecard.com, where on Saturday, on the weekend, President Donald Trump weighed into what was happening in the Texas Capitol and said he's going to be watching the Texas House. Michael, what brought that up?
Yeah, so of course, Donald Trump has made school choice a big issue for his presidential campaign. He's pushing at the federal level. And obviously, he's also very close with Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick, a big supporter of school choice. So on Saturday, you saw all that kind of come to a head with the president posting to Truth Social that he, congratulating. It kind of started off as a congratulatory tweet or a congratulatory post to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and State Senator Brandon Creighton for getting school choice across the finish line for the 900th time, it feels like, in the past couple of years. And then he kind of, swerves over to saying, but we all know the real problem and the real challenge is going to be in the Texas House, where they keep killing it. And so he said that he's going to be watching the Texas House. And I have to think, Brandon, that when the President of the United States, a guy who was just not only reelected in a very, elected again, I guess you would say, in a very decisive fashion, who has now been going through and just, slashing and burning his way through the deep state and the swamp of Washington, D.C. in these past couple of weeks, that Republican House members have to be thinking, oh, I hope we get this done. And so, of course, Dustin Burrows really had no choice but to post on Twitter a simple two-word response: "We will," he said.
And we will see, whether or not they do. Right now, with school choice legislation in particular, the Senate passed it last week. That's sitting in the House right now.
Sitting in the inbox of the clerk's office, probably the right way to say it.
Exactly right.
It's sitting there. So.
Exactly right. And it'd be hard for the House to do anything on school choice really in the immediate future for at least one major reason. That's the fact that to this day right now, we're almost a month in, the House still does not have committee assignments, which means they don't even really have a mechanism yet to be able to hear the bill.
Yeah, and look, significantly, it's very likely. In fact, I think it's as almost as sure as you can get that the committees will be appointed sometime this week. Theoretically, the House gavel's in at 2:00 today. Theoretically, Speaker Burrows could gavel them in, pray, do the pledges, and announce committee assignments. That could happen. Historically, it happens on the last day of the week, the last day of the legislative week. So it may not be today. But the more significant thing, Brandon, you did a piece a couple of weeks ago looking at the calendar dates relevant to the legislative session. This Thursday, the 13th, marks the 30th day of the session in which committees, House and Senate committees, can just start doing regular business. They can actually on Thursday start passing legislation. They can start holding hearings, all those kind of things. Of course, the House could have been doing that already, like the Senate had. The House could have had preliminary meetings. So again, I think a lot of House members, particularly on this question of school choice, particularly on this point of the President of the United States saying he's watching them, they have to be thinking, I sure hope Burrows has a plan, because right now it's hard to see the plan for most folks observing from the outside.
Certainly, especially when you see Democrats who largely supported Dustin Burrows. Remember, he got more Democrat support than Republican support. Almost all the majority, I should say, of Democrats supported Dustin Burrows in his speakership. They're currently right now on a crusade against school choice. They've been, holding press conferences. They've been in the news talking about how they are essentially wanting to side with teachers unions and want to kill school choice legislation again. And so it's a really interesting predicament I think Dustin Burrows finds himself in, where, his constituency as of the first day of the session is largely Democrats. Does he try to please them, or does he try to please Republicans by passing not only a priority of the president now, but Governor Abbott and so many conservative Texans?
And let's not brush too quickly past where the opposition's coming from. Yes, the Democrats, but you also had Ken King, a Republican from the Panhandle, kind of his district, kind of real close to Dustin Burrows' district. Ken King come out and say he's a hard no on school choice. He doesn't care what the president thinks. He doesn't care what voters think. He doesn't care what the Republican Party thinks. Doesn't care, all those things. He's going to be a hard no on any school choice legislation. I'm always going to take at their word what people say. Dustin Burrows says that he's going to be pushing to move school choice out, but this is going to be a hard lift for him.
Yes, and so we're going to be keeping an eye on that. But over in the Senate, we've already got, school choice, they've done that, right? And so we'll see if the House picks that up or if they have their own proposal. But the Senate's not stopping there. They've got a couple of committee hearings this week, one of them actually happening already this morning, talking about one of Governor Abbott's priorities, which is property tax relief.
Property tax relief. Now, very fascinating, in the governor's of the state address, he made reference to rate compression, and he talked a lot about compressing the rate, using surplus dollars to buy down the rate of property taxes. That was kind of the push he made in his State of the State address. But this is where speeches versus the actual order signed can sometimes vary, because in the order that the governor signed, where he transmitted his emergencies to the legislature, he just said property tax relief, and he didn't specify in that order how to be done, which means the Texas Senate, what they're taking up is State Senator Paul Betcourt's both legislation, then an accompanying constitutional amendment that would greatly expand the homestead exemption in Texas. So that's a way to ensure that property tax relief goes to homeowners directly and specifically.
Yes, and they already raised it to $100,000 session. I can't remember, what was it before $100,000?
60, I think.
Something like that. Raise it to 100. This legislation would raise it to $140,000 or $150,000 for seniors. And that's been the Senate's approach. They've always much favored the homestead exemption.
With a little bit of rate compression on it.
Yeah, they've certainly been in favor of that approach. There's pros and cons. People have that discussion all over the place. We won't get into details there. But essentially, at the end of the day, I think what people are looking for is not exactly the way they do the property tax relief, but they're looking at this surplus that we have, and the state's facing, I think, a $24 billion surplus. They're saying, how much of that can we give back to property taxpayers? Whatever method they decide to do it.
Right. And so, so the Senate Local Government Committee is going to be hearing that. They're literally hearing that right now as we speak. They started their hearing about 20 minutes ago. They're literally discussing that right now. But then later today, tomorrow, you've got the Senate Committee on Criminal Justice meeting to hear bail reform. They're going to be talking about several pieces of legislation, all filed by State Senator Joan Huffman, also of Houston. Crimes and other heinous crimes. So they're going to be cracking down on that. Joan Huffman has both legislation and constitutional amendments there.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's what the Senate is up to. And we'll see if those pass out of committee this week. If it's anything like school choice, then they're moving quick, and they probably will pass out committee. It's up to how fast they pass out of the Senate, pass it over to the House. I mean, we could very well end up with a situation where the Senate has passed, almost all or all of Governor Abbott's emergency items, of which he has 7, by the time the House has actual committee hearings.
Right. And let's remember that, again, why this emergency designation is important is because the state constitution forbids legislation from moving out of the chamber until the 60th legislative day, which is March 15th. But designated as an emergency governor, it gets fast. It can move ahead of that 60 days. And so when we have some big, say contentious issues, the contentious, but contentious issues, the sooner you get those passed, the more likely you are to address other items may not be on the governor's emergency list, but are nonetheless important to various parties and factions and other things. So all this now is a calendar game. All the Constitution of the state of Texas essentially exists to kill legislation, which is usually a good thing.
Sure.
But yet, when there are big things that taxpayers and Texans want done, they really kind of want those things to pass. So you're working against a calendar designed to kill legislation.
Absolutely, and that's its design. That's why we talk so much about these deadlines and about what they're doing day to day. I mean, the House and the Senate, for that matter, are coming off of a pretty long weekend.
Right.
They've had pretty long weekends. Now, I would say the Senate, to their credit, has actually passed a bill by now, right?
Right.
But both chambers coming off of long weekends, and that's where it really starts to matter. It's not, at the end of the session when they run out of time, when these bills hit the end of the calendar.
They all start posting pictures of themselves at midnight, working for the people of the fighting 109th district or whatever.
Exactly.
They play up the long hours. 2 days have long hours.
Exactly.
No, we forget these night weekends and things.
Exactly, and they'll show the problem then, and they'll likely be there working pretty long on those last few days, but it all comes back to how to manage the calendar in the beginning of this. Ultimately, the results will be proven out at the end of this 140 days.
Well, Brandon Waltons, thanks for standing here with me on The Advance this morning, and thank you for joining us. We look forward to visiting with you again next week. Of course, check out all of our shows, all of our content at texasscorecard.com, and I hope you have a fantastic Tuesday.